You're in charge of the program. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. My name is Lina Dokuzović. I'm artistic director of Woche, and we are so happy to collaborate together with Depo Kunst und Diskussion on the series of discussions around the topics of our festival. We just wanted to greet you and ask you to follow up.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah van Dordrecht. I'm the director of Depot, and I'm so happy that we can host the discussion series, 7 discussions in 7 days. So come back. This is also the first event of our season. So welcome again to that. And our event is recorded. We also do a live stream in YouTube. If you have questions, we will approach you with a microphone. If you don't want to be recorded, just give us a sign. And I would like to invite you to stay afterwards at Depot Café and join our social media, Depot Wien, and visit more events of the Woche and have a nice evening. And we're looking forward to the discussion. Welcome here and welcome online. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Okay, thanks so much. I would like to introduce you all to this first panel for the theory program of Woche, which is looking at working class ecologies, and it's titled Invisible Reproductive Labor and Dispossessed Care. And so there'll be 3 presentations. And just to say, we'll have a couple of questions after each presentation so that we can keep track of everything, and then there'll be time for a more open discussion at the end. So first, I'm really happy to welcome Professor Encarnación Gutiérrez Rodríguez, who will present her paper, Affective Labor and Decolonial Mourning, Reproductive Labor Between Biopolitics and Necropolitics. She is a professor in sociology with a focus on culture and migration at the Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main. She's published widely on gender, migration, and care work, and engages post-Marxist and decolonial perspectives, as well as feminist and queer epistemologies. She has been an early and staunch advocate of decolonial theory in the German-speaking world, and among her many publications is the book Migration, Domestic Work and Affect, and also Decolonial Perspectives on Entangled Inequalities, Europe and the Caribbean, among many others. So Encarnación, welcome, and we're really excited to hear your talk today.
Thank you, Roseanne, and thank you to my co-speakers also, Anna and Lina, and also to the organizers, I think Dennis Guvenso, Jelan Michik, Natasha Makuliak, and the others that are behind the streaming and everything. So thank you to all, and for the kind of care work you're also doing on that level. I have changed actually my talk a bit, because first it's online, so I try not to read so much as possible so that you can follow me better. And there are 2 questions later, so we can maybe unwrap it a bit more through the questions. Precarious analysis has inspired the debate on social reproduction by interrogating the dynamics of the feminization of labor in Western European urban settings as an outcome of contemporary neoliberal politics and austerity measures organized around a binary gender system through which feminized bodies are produced. Identifying the intersection of bodies, spaces, desires, and capitalist relationalities, Precarious determines social reproduction as the primordial constitutive site of the production and accumulation of capital. Following precarious analysis and insisting on the relevance of household work as living labor, sustaining capital production, accumulation, and circulation, I discuss in my examination of domestic work, migration, and affect, social reproduction along affective social relations. Social reproduction is thus not just constituted by the production of the labor force, but in particular, the tangible and intangible dimensions of social relations and their reproductive forces and assemblages. Precarious proposal of social reproduction as encompassing the continuum of production, reproduction, and my understanding of social reproduction as nested in affective social relation has broadened other understandings of social reproduction. For example, Susan Ferguson's understanding of social reproduction that goes beyond labor power as the ultimate source of reproduction. Ferguson suggests that we look at social relations outside of labor relations in order to capture what she says, the processes and institutions through which labor power is reproduced. Seeking to widen the perspective on social reproduction by considering what she calls a wider sociality, integral to the very existence and operation of capitalism and class, Ferguson proposes an analysis of social reproduction that integrates unpaid or low-paid work, often disregarded in Marxist analysis of capital production. Ferguson takes up here an old argument from Heidi Hartmann and Christine Delphi. Drawing attention to the intangible character of household work as unwage or low-wage labor, these scholars note that the tasks related to this work, coined also as the 3 Cs, cleaning, caring, and cooking, remain largely invisible in society and are not accounted, for example, in the gross national product. In this vein, also the US-American economists and sociologists Isabella Baker and Nancy Fulbright identified care work as the neurologic node of social reproduction in a gendered political economy, while the Spanish feminist economist Amaya Pérez Orozco proposes that we shift the equation between capital and labor to that of capital and care. Basque sociologists Machalén Legarreta Isa and the Uruguayan sociologist Karina Batiani examine in this context the value of care work by attending to a time metric that accounts for the intangible and tangible value produced by the numerous tasks of personal attention, support, and maintenance on the emotional, physical, psychological, social, and relational levels. Including a perspective that takes into account care relationships also in queer, non-binary, alternative gender and transgender settings, and also theoretically interrogating social reproduction from this angle, theories such as Martin Manalasan, Aren Aizura, Jules John Gleason, Francis Sick, and Ele O'Rourke have deconstructed the heteronormative matrix underpinning debates on social reproduction by accentuating the analysis of non-binary gendered social relations and cooperation, in other words, what they call communizing care. Centering on the analysis of the feminization of reproductive labor, these perspectives have broadened and complicated Marxist understandings of the relationship between production and reproduction. Exploring immaterial labor and the subjective, emotional, and affective character of capitalism, these theories have paid attention to the sphere of life that have been perceived, for example, by Habermas as the Lebenswelt, the sphere governed by intimacy, affects, and sociality, or as Veronica Schild asserts, echoing Wendy Brown, the life form. In advanced capitalism, this sphere is increasingly penetrated by the logic of capital production, accumulation, new forms of the organization of work shaped by the use of new media and the blurring between the home and the workplace, which has received a new dimension during the COVID pandemic through the expansion of home office, have transformed the sphere of the private household to the workplace and interpolated the so-called autonomous organizational capacities of the workforce. Certain production sectors, such as the creative personal service call centers industry, are increasingly based on self-organized forms of work, a feature that is also characteristic of the care and household work sector. This transformation of work is accompanied by a flexibilization and individualization of work contracts, resulting often in lowering of pay and an increase in irregular working conditions, as well as diminishing of bargain workers' rights. Social reproduction theory has addressed this transformation of paid work and drawn attention also to the persistent irregular working conditions in the care and household work sector. Debates critically referring to social reproduction theory have drawn attention also to this to the heteronormative discursive matrix of this approach, and as I already mentioned, accentuated an intersectional analysis of social reproduction, while others have also reactivated the nature-society angle through the focus, for example, on extractivism, or actually try to re-theorize it, or also, as, for example, Tanya Rizbolya, Miriam Tola talk about the reinvention also of socio-ecological reproduction. And I've seen that you have another talk tomorrow about this specific debates. So these two looking at extractivism and socio-ecological reproduction are focusing on social reproduction by looking at social relations in regard to the planet, to the environment, and to multi-species context. All these debates, while distinctive in their approaches, share an interest in social reproduction as the site of the communal production of life. Common to these debates in their engagement with is the engagement with the biopolitical dimension of social reproduction. Yet social reproduction needs to be thought along the tension of biopolitics, the production of life, and necropolitics, the extinction of life. In Revolution at Point Zero, Silvia Federici observes that capitalism not only engages in the production of life, but also in its exploitation and destruction. Social reproduction takes place between these two poles, production and destruction. From this vantage point, the analysis of social reproduction requires that we consider not only the politics of life, but also that of extinction. Am I good with the time?
You have 8 minutes.
8 minutes. Okay, so just briefly, when I think about extinction, I'm looking then at the context of coloniality. Am I looking also at the context of how the governing of death as a system of a society forms part of the production of life, connected to what means also death. In my previous work, I have engaged with this work by looking especially at migration policies, by looking also at precarity, and also the kind of irregularities within labor employment relationships, but also what it meant also for the persons delivering the work in the household when they were threatened by deportation, when they were threatened actually by a constant uncertainty about how to organize the lives, but also how to continue on. So I think that the logic of extinction has been announced through the perspective on coloniality and also racism, but also looking at feminization as a moment of devaluation. And I call it also in my previous work as a kind of a colonial déjà vu that is being reproduced. Now, what I like to look more, and I like to give it as part of the discussion, is to look more at how death is actually part of our lives within, and how the dealing with death actually constitute also the field of social reproduction. And I can't show you actually the work of my colleagues in Spain that they've done. It's an amazing work. They presented it in the 5th Transforming Care Conference in 2021, in June 21, in Venice. And it's the work from Dolors Comas Dajemir from the University Rovira i Virgili in Catalonia, and Marina Sagastizabal Emilio Yus from the BAS University in Bilbao, and Cristina Garcia Sainz from the Autonomous University of Madrid. And the paper is called Working in a Residential Care Home in Times of COVID-19, Dislocation in Work Time and Course of Life. And I already referred to Machalen's work before, and also Batani's work, and how they try to understand how time works when we look at care work, and what the work from Dolors Comas Dajemir, Marina Sagastizabal, Emilio Yuso, Cristina Garcia Sainz do when they look at time is that they look on the one side the requirements of time set by the institutions, set by the environment, and then also the kind of personal times of the workers, but then also what they call, and this is something that Machalen looks very much at, what they call the chaos also, when those times are disrupted by other moments of time. And this disruption, they describe it here in this paper, and I would just like to read you part of this paper in order to try to understand and discuss together what I have been suggesting or try to suggest to look at necropolitics. And what they do here, they have been talking to different care workers in elderly homes, and they refer to these accounts of these care workers. And they speak also about what it meant for them, the direct physical contact, how it was transformed during the pandemic, how a kind of non-contact was imposed, and what it meant to care without touching. And they say here, and I quote them, the relational dimension of care is lost. The bond form in the day-to-day is abruptly broken by simply wearing a mask, for example. It is even worse with the full body protective suits. So that's what the care workers were telling them. And they also talk about what it meant, for example, that emergency military units came into the care homes, that they were all of a sudden confronted with rubbish bags, that the properties and the belongings of the people in the care homes were put in these rubbish bags that their care workers needed to deal with too and face. While they were having also these personal hygiene protocols. And I like to finish it by this observation that the two just to think what it means for them, and or what it means actually to think through necropolitics. And I will just cite them, and they say here, the entire situation was birthed by the pain and impotence of seeing the death of residents they had known and looked after. Terrible situations like Maria Jose, who is still traumatized by having found several bodies in the garage when she went for cleaning instruments, or the pain that Marie-Luz felt as she selected clothes in the laundry and cried when she found residents listed as dead. She felt that these losses were personal, as, so they're quoting her, they had become a part of us. And she says further, I couldn't have even imagined this in a film, said Carmen. She sobbed when she got on the bus with the infected elderly women being taken to a COVID center. It was horrible, remarked Carla. That was the atmosphere they had to cope with at work. So I think, yeah, I leave it here for our discussion. And yeah, and I think in the questions and also in the discussion, we might also go to another aspect that I'm not touching on here, because of course the work is also having political responses to this, and also are having different ways of organizing also. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for this incredibly moving presentation, which I think probably took us all back to this moment in 2020 when this was kind of, when we were seeing this on the news all the time, or maybe even experiencing it depending on our depending on where we were. We just have time for like one question perhaps for Encarnación. Does anyone have an immediate question? Otherwise, I would maybe ask something. But if there's an immediate question, I don't want to dominate too much. But okay, I'm just curious if, so we'll definitely come back to this in the discussion later. But and I think it's so important to bring this question of mourning into into social reproduction theory, or even this, and also this like multiply our understanding or nuance our understanding of care, so that it's not only economical. But I'm curious as to how you think about the kind of the directive of refusal that was at the heart of the kind of social reproduction debates of the 1970s, especially around wages for housework, and then this in relation to this new, or in relation to the kind of current conjuncture, and what this asks us to think about in relation to this analysis. Just if you have anything to say about that, otherwise we move on.
Well, I think that, of course, the debates on refusal are important. The debates that actually talk about the devaluation of work that is necessary for our maintenance, our lives, and also for the maintenance of communities and the planet and so on. I think that at the moment we are at a point where we are not just looking at what has been perceived, let's say, a kind of liberal perspective on care work as something that individuals do. For other individuals, we have quite broadened the scope in regard of thinking care in ethical and also in broader planetary terms, I would say. And when the question of mourning brings us back, at least it brings me back to think along those lines, because we all mourn. That's what and not me only, a lot of people busy with mourning say that mourning is never completed. And mourning is not just an act of commemoration. Mourning is something that when we are mourning is part of our lives and is part of our connections to our ancestors. And it's even part of our vision of the future or so. Because especially if we are living in a broken world, or somebody that look very much at mourning, Rose, she speaks about the broken middle and why she speaks about mourning. So remove mourning from the sphere of the privatization of the pain of loss and set it as part of the communizing of care. I'm not somebody that loves so much the term care, but I know there is a debate, so I do. I've been more socialized within this debate in the Spanish context with the term cuidados, but there are other terms to think maybe this broken middle is something that has to do with our maintenance and maybe also the vision of good living together, and realizing that it's only possible when we are because we are interdependent. And I think this is an aspect that care and also household work and the whole debate on household work and reproductive labor has taught us that we are interdependent. So it's not something that we choose, it's something that we need to live. And so I think mourning, it has to do I look very much at political work that is happening everywhere on mourning. And when I started my work on mourning, I was myself mourning my parents' loss and also the loss in the Mediterranean. But I came across so many forms of political mourning that have to do with abolition, that have to do with reparations, and with thinking that we live in this contradictory, that we live in antagonistic relations. And I think what we have forgotten often in this perspective on social reproduction is this entanglement that modernity has with coloniality. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I also love that you brought up Rose, and yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think we should move swiftly on. Our next speaker is here. Lina Dokuzović. I really practiced this many times, but then I failed. Okay, we'll present her paper Invisible Labor and Making Blind Spots Visible. She works with at the intersection between visual art and text and knowledge production, and her research and artistic work deal with the topics of migration, knowledge production, mechanisms of appropriation, and the privatization of structures such as education, culture, and the body and land, as well as perspectives for translocal solidarity. And she is the author of Struggles for Living Learning. So welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. So as the title implied, I'll be talking about invisibility and invisible labor, and particularly focusing on the role of migrant labor. Can you hear me okay? It doesn't sound very loud. There's a variety of ways in which labor can be made invisible. I will go ahead and clump them into two main categories. So one of them being a discursive level and the other one being a more concrete level, with which I mean types of labor that are actually moved from the public space, which are out in the outskirts and the peripheries, that are often shrouded with taboo, for instance, sex work and things that many people don't even know exist. Whereas on the discursive level, I'm referring to some of the things that we've heard now. So care work, affective work, reproductive labor, a lot of the things that are happening in plain sight in front of us all of the time that people simply are not recognizing as work or compensating as such. So these two different perspectives, they work hand in hand, and that's quite important to know. They strengthen each other in their processes, and they become relevant in the different examples that I'm going to give. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the guest worker era. So for those who aren't familiar with that, or I suppose many people will be, some years ago, there was a plethora of cultural projects around the 50-year anniversary of the guest worker bilateral agreement. So it was an agreement between, in this case, Austria, but it was also other kind of Western European countries with Eastern European countries or Southeast for cheap labor for rebuilding Europe after World War II. So in a kind of ravaged post-World War II space, cheap labor was brought in, a lot of construction, a lot of focus on construction work to literally rebuild things. And what was very interesting about this era, and why I'm using this to kind of introduce the contemporary situation, is that it created a mechanism in which the needs of the economy and the needs of the social context, but especially focusing on the economy, were regulating and in direct correlation with the amount and the type of migration that was coming in. So there was a prioritization for certain types of workers, and they were promoted and they were invited. Some stayed, but for the most part, it was set up in a way that at the termination of the contract, they would go back home. Also during this commemoration, this 50-year anniversary, where a lot of the cultural projects were supported and pushed, some of the local politicians were using this as a kind of best case example for, in a sense, disciplining contemporary migrants. So trying to say that these were the good ones and what you're doing now is all bad. And you need to look at this model, which is a bit ironic because many of them overstayed their welcome, and it's quite a funny context, but it set down this very interesting framework for something that would come later on, but that would be transformed with certain shifts that would take place in the economy, which have also become quite a bit invisible. So I'll try to elaborate on those. So what we had then with this kind of scale of economic need and types and number of migrants that were coming in and then sort of terminating them when the job was finished, now discursively speaking, the overflow of migrants that are coming in that are no longer necessary for the economic desires are being referred to as a migrant crisis. So there's this shift in a time now where everything is being sensationalized and catastrophized. We're now referring to just about everything as a crisis. And the irony there is that we saw in the former example a situation of crisis that was inviting people to actually alleviate that crisis. And now the people who are actually the most vulnerable in this context are being referred to as the crisis themselves. So that's a bit relevant and a bit recurring in all of these different processes. So what we have now is such a significant shift, apparently, that is being referred to by policymakers as a new renaissance in Europe. So what I'm referring to is a shift to a knowledge-based economy. And what a knowledge-based economy is, or cognitive capitalism, a good definition is given by the critical proponent of the theory of cognitive capitalism, Jan Mollier-Boutin. And he describes it as the work of the pollination within a beehive as opposed to the direct production of honey. So if you can kind of imagine that the networks and the passive communication and the production of data and production of knowledge and institutions of education and elsewhere, lifelong learning, all of these abstract forms, along with what I guess many of us have heard of, data mining and that kind of thing online, it's all production of knowledge, and it's all very much at the core of the European agendas economically today. So we can go back about 22 years. So in the year 2000, the Lisbon strategy was introduced. And in 1999, the Bologna process was introduced. And in the following years, several other parallel things and consequences of the two are sort of packaged together. So the Lisbon strategy outlined a path for the European Union to be able to become the strongest, most competitive, and essentially most aggressive knowledge-based economy in the world. The Bologna process along with the Ljubljana process and several other processes for lifelong learning, they basically came together to build this knowledge triangle. That's the foundation of the innovation union that's sort of strengthening all of these different agendas of the European Union. The Bologna process was specifically focusing on universities and the others on research facilities and lifelong learning. So they're supposed to then capture all knowledge production in all spaces at all times. So that was kind of the umbrella agenda approach that was taking place. The Bologna process, on the one hand, I think many people have heard of, and it was transforming universities from the inside. So introducing tuition fees, restructuring things, major transformations that I don't have to go into too much. But what a lot of people weren't so familiar with was that the goal of that was parallel to these other different things, was the production of the European higher education area. And the other two that I mentioned, the research and the lifelong learning, were also creating overlapping kind of schemes that were the European research area and the area for lifelong learning. So these are basically outlined, bordered spaces within the European Union that sort of overlap but aren't exactly congruent with the European Union, that outline the space in which the movement, the free movement of education can happen and is promoted. So there are 4 freedoms of the EU. They're considered the kind of major pinnacles of upholding the, great foundation of the European Union. And they're the freedom of movement of goods, capital, services, and people. So in this case, actually, there was a proposal to introduce knowledge as the 5th freedom of the EU, but that was scrapped because it was actually after these reforms qualifying as a good, capital, and service, so it was no longer necessary. But the big question that I want to focus on is the movement of people and which people that actually addresses. So going back a little bit to the Lisbon strategy and the different goals outlined there, and why a knowledge economy and why knowledge production is so important for all of these different agendas. They're outlined in all of these different policy papers as essentially resolving the grand challenges of our time. And that's actually a quote in policy papers that's recurring, the grand challenges of our time. So this is all of these catastrophic things you're hearing about all the time, the constant economic recurring waves of crisis, ecological crisis, climate change, social problems, etc. They're all kind of clumped into these grand challenges of our time. And all of that should be resolved by knowledge somehow. So on the one hand, there's the knowledge and the research to try to resolve these issues. On the other hand, there's the economic production of all of these new mechanisms. Then there's the commercialization of universities, the redirection towards more private facilities for research and for higher education, disinvestment in universities, which is also very profitable, which I'll touch on a little bit later. All of these different things. And ironically, during all of this restructuring over those 20 years that I described from 99 and 2000 until today, what you've ended up, or the way that it was dictated, was instead of talking about these things actually resolving crisis, which was described and outlined in the policy papers, the way that it was pitched to the universities was saying that it was resolving the crisis in education. So there have always been issues in institutions of higher education, but in this particular case, it was actually used as the driving force. And instead of resolving the problems that many people were complaining about, it was completely restructuring institutions along these other things to, in fact, alleviate a different crisis that had nothing to do with the one that was being addressed. So it's essentially been outlined as a kind of sustainability policy. And what I, in my work, have tried to outline is that, in fact, it's quite the opposite. And it's just a way of pushing things to the peripheries, pushing problems to the peripheries. It is not, I believe that the production of all of these types of knowledge are not the ultimate immaterial production that will replace all material production and take us out of some sort of resource crisis, as these policy papers claim. I think it's just pushing the reliance that's still there on resources, on material resources, on natural resources to the peripheries, to the global south, to other areas where they're invisible. And I think making people a little bit more comfortable in the European space and feeling a little bit better about the changes that are taking place, but without realizing that in fact, there's not much that's changing. So I touched briefly on the way that disinvestment is actually becoming profitable. So there's an interesting phenomenon. So the European space that I was referring to, these kind of overlapping things, but we'll summarize it with the European higher education area, is this kind of supranational competitive area that's competing with other supranational areas, kind of economic zones, who also aspire to be the strongest knowledge economies in trying to create this kind of global competition and strengthen each other in this process. And one of the other most aggressive spaces that's trying to push for this is Australia. They're really quite a phenomenal example, and I think very interesting to look to see where certain tendencies are going into the direction of. So on the one hand, already in 2006, 2007, in statistics, knowledge exports were ranked third highest after the export of coal and iron ore. And they were then elevated to first place for the export of services, already then exceeding tourism. And tourism in Australia is very high, so that's really noteworthy. Knowledge exports, you might ask, very, very peculiar concept. So on one level, yes, it can be what it sounds like. So the export of sometimes reform packages or publications or facilities or offshore universities or a variety of different things. But the majority of what they refer to in Australia when they refer to knowledge exports is basically foreign students that are invited to study there. So there's a lot of these recruitment centers set up abroad where they're actually very aggressively recruited to come to study in Australia. And they're invited to come, and it's basically the accumulation of the brain gain and the financial gain that comes from them paying higher tuition, higher living costs, becoming indebted, usually ending up in quite devastating situations because they're not informed of the situations that they're going to confront. And some 10 years ago, there were actually quite a lot of instances in the news of racist attacks because there were a lot of people being targeted from especially India and China, and there turned out to be quite a heavy anti-Asian racist sentiment that was emerging at the time that was also developing in congruence with certain migration policies and certain racist rhetoric that was circulating in the media, which I'll get to in a moment. So basically, foreign students dumping cash and brain gain and then leaving as soon as possible is what a knowledge export is. So there were, parallel to all of these new processes that were inviting all of these foreign students to come and study, there were new visa and migration policies, an entire new system that was brought in, this points-based policy, that was working hand in hand with these institutions of education to try to regulate that. And this is where I want to link to what I was talking about in the beginning, which was these mechanisms for inviting and filtering the types of people who are coming in to cater to the current economic desires. So it's very closely, very intricately tweaked to be able to focus on and target certain types of people to come in, for some of them to stay a short time, and for the ones that optimally benefit the local economic situation to stay longer. And what we see, and why I began by outlining these different spaces, so this European higher education area and the way that this works with the borders of the European Union, is that the European Union's visa and migration regime is actually now working in collaboration with institutions of higher education and with all of these different reforms that were implemented to actually filter and regulate the ways and the types of movement of people. So what you have in Australia now is a structural dependence on foreign students. So because of this public disinvestment, you now have really the reliance on these people to come. And in connection with that, you end up with these stricter migration policies. And then, of course, a lot of the racist rhetoric that's circulating in the media that justifies all of this. We're seeing the rapid development of something extremely similar in the UK, where you actually have professors policing students. In some cases, if a student is not attending every lecture, I think I heard one example where if they don't show up 3 times, they can be deported, which is quite absurd. And in 2016, the beloved Sebastian Kurz, in an interview with ORF, he outlined that he wants to change Austria to become more like the Australian model and to adopt that. So it's not so much a matter of Austria looking like Australia, but what we have, and I won't go into too much detail because I don't have the time, is a European context in which the different member states are actually trying to imitate each other in a type of competition that's regulated by a certain governance policy by the EU. And what we're going to see inevitably is an increase in that direction. So things have been put in place. The different reform packages have been unfolding over the years, and things will start to go in that direction. And the border and migration policy already has been putting the mechanisms into place for this to take place here and elsewhere. It's just a matter of how and when we will see these things unfold. So I will tell another short story of what we see at the other end of these things, and then I'll try to conclude, and I think that should be right on time. So on the one hand, you've got certain types of people who are contributing to the knowledge economy who are being supported. And one of the things that was introduced with the Lisbon strategy and all of these different policy papers that I outlined was an extreme emphasis on mobility. So mobility is considered to be like the grand accelerator of knowledge. And when people are moving through a space, you're getting more brain gain, more, it follows the same logic of economic turnover. So when you're producing things quicker and things are coming out of a space and they're not sitting as long, when things are circulating as quickly as possible, you're getting more and more production. So this is the logic that's being attached to knowledge now. And so with all of these different spaces, so whether it's kind of workspace learning, universities, research facilities, they're really pushing mobility. The irony here, so we're prioritizing certain types of workers. We're really pushing that people within that space move as much as possible. But at the other end, you have all of the other workers, which are now trying to be pushed out. And now we've got a bigger gap in the middle. And all the types of workers that were prioritized in previous generations, like the ones that I opened with, are now going to become more and more invisible because they're not a priority of the market anymore. So they're going to be pushed to the other end, and we're experiencing what's more and more of a segregation of the types of movement that's taking place. So one of the examples, in 2017, there was a G20 Insights paper that was released around debates that they were having during the meeting about the refugee crisis. The famous refugee crisis. And the paper was proposing that the only way to sustainably integrate refugees was to primarily focus on employment options for them. Seems like a plausible concept to me. But the immediate turn was to say that because of economic turbulence that seems to be never ending in the European space, what we need to understand is that definitely the local people will develop tremendous feelings of animosity because they will understand these outsiders as coming to take their jobs, and they will never be accepted. And essentially, these people are unintegratable. So what do we do with this situation? How do we integrate the unintegratable? And they proposed this very terrifying option, but a very noteworthy one. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with special economic zones. Bit of a roar there. So the suggestion was for made for refugee special economic zones. So they are something that was widespread, popularized, put into practice, I'm not sure which term to use, predominantly in China and India. And what they are is basically corporate enclaves on foreign soil in which it's basically its own entity where the local laws don't exist anymore. All protection of human rights, protection of workers is suspended to prioritize the type of production taking place there. Anything can happen in these places. So when you hear about all of these mass suicides and horrifying things that are taking place in Western corporations that have their seats in countries like China or India, also elsewhere, but those two are the kind of the highest concentration of where they are. That's what a special economic zone is. So they're talking about building those now in the peripheries of the European space to be able to use them as kind of halfway integration points for putting refugees on the outskirts, making their work invisible and making them therefore not intimidating to the other people who are local, who might feel that this is, you know, this labor is too much for them to deal with, and this crisis is hitting too close to home. So you have this huge gap now between the types of movement that's prioritized and the treatment of the type of people that are actually coming in. So I'll try to close at this one point, which is a little bit of a focus on the idea of vulnerability. So for many of us who have dealt with difficulties in our paths of migration into Europe or into the European Union over the years, many of us have felt vulnerability. As I mentioned, the present day, the pandemic, the various crises, it seems it's kind of this never-ending overlapping series of disasters and catastrophes and crises that we're hearing about all of the time. People can't even watch the news anymore. It's impossible and overwhelming. And those of us who are in vulnerable situations are feeling even more vulnerable and even more in a state of crisis. And then we are actually being labeled as the crisis. So what I'd like to then outline, or what I'd like to point to, is that, as I mentioned before, this guest worker era, the invitation of migrants before they were terminated and asked to leave, they were invited as a reaction to economic crisis. So these knowledge economy agendas were actually enacted as a solution to a series of crises, a vast series of crises. Now we have migrants and refugees, but I'll go ahead and call them all migrants and not introduce this gap, are being labeled as a crisis. And what we need to understand there is that the vulnerability and the crisis is actually in this system, this instability that is trying to patch itself and reinvent itself all of the time. This form of capitalism that's relying on material resources that are limited and trying to reinvent itself by claiming that now it's shifting towards immaterial resources, which does not exist, in fact. And all of the various structural instabilities that are connected with this is where the crisis lies. This is where the vulnerability lies. And in fact, the strength is with us. And what we need to understand is that we cannot buy this nonsense about being crisis. We are actually very much at the core of what's happening, of a positive change that's taking place or that can take place. We have the agency, and the crisis is actually coming exactly from the point that's creating all of this rhetoric pointing back at us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for really orienting our perspective and making or showing this vulnerability. We have time for one question. So, is there anyone who has feels urgency for Anna or Encarnación? No? Okay. I just have, I mean, your presentation is really like devastating, actually. So it's also quite difficult to form a question immediately in response to it. But maybe, like, I don't know, what do you see as the kind of, or how do you see, maybe do you see this emphasis on vulnerability in relation to also this kind of interminable mourning that Encarnación was talking about? Is there a connection? Maybe we come back to that later.
Yeah, maybe
It's
I'll
just
think
what
on
comes
that.
to
It's an
mind.
interesting question, but I think I'll have to digest it a little bit.
That's
Maybe in
okay.
the bigger discussion.
Okay. Do you
Okay.
have anything else to add?
I do have a question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay.
I was wondering about invisibility, what you define as invisible work.
Mhm.
And I think this is quite interesting to look at how this recruitment programs and kind of global capitalist competitive programs create new zones of, let's say, demand. But at the same time, I would say that there are like the old invisible
Yeah.
remains, and that it's not creating a visibility. If we just think about care work, still, even on the level of policies, there are the bilateral programs, for example, in Germany, between Germany and Poland or other Eastern European countries. But still, when you think about these recruitment policies and where they can accumulate, this is not an area that is being addressed, which is interesting, no? Because you could say, okay, this could be also an asset, no? So I was wondering, what do you think about these old invisibilities that remain?
Yeah, they of course still remain. One of the points that I was trying to make was that that area will just grow. So now a lot of the types of workers that were, let's say, tolerated for a while, that were prioritized in the past, will now be shifted a little bit more towards the invisible, which is a problem. I mean, what's potentially interesting about that, and you mentioned the work of Bacchius earlier, which is noteworthy in connection with this. So what they did was to ask the question, like, what is your strike? And to look at types of struggles that people have now. So instead of, uniting factory workers, it was looking at precarity as being the kind of foundation for struggle and bringing together people from all different sectors. So I think looking from that perspective, it provides a very interesting new opportunity when there will be more and more people clumped together with the old invisible people, where it's been so difficult to make that work visible. Now, as it's going to be growing and increasing, and possibly will not be as feminized anymore. So now there will be perhaps all different types of workers, but a lot of manual labor and that kind of thing that will also be kind of clumped together with this invisible work. Maybe that will provide some different opportunities for coming together, for exposing connections between these types of invisibility.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think we have to move on to our final speaker. So I'd really like us to welcome Anna Vilenica, who will present her paper, Dispossessed Care and Struggles for Care Infrastructures in Serbia. Anna is an ERC postdoctoral research fellow at DIST at Turin Polytechnic, and she is a core member at Beyond Inhabitation Lab. She is an urban and cultural researcher and her interest is in decoloniality in Eastern Europe, housing and no border struggles, as well as feminist methodologies. She has edited 4 books, among which Radical Housing, Art, Struggle, Care is the most recent. And she is a member of the Radical Housing Journal editorial collective and a member of Spokes Council of the Interface Journal for and about social movements, both are dedicated to open source publishing. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, Roseanne, and thank you, Lina and Encarnación, for your wonderful presentations. I really hope that I will be able to contribute further to discussion. I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to show you my really text-based slides, so I'm the only one with the privilege to see them now. What I would like to say at the beginning is that the work that I do is very much rooted in the social movements that I was part of, like in the last 20 years, from feminist movement, different urban struggles, housing movement, no border struggles. And I see very much, the work the research work that I do and the intellectual work and the journalist work as a part of what we could call movement making. I like to use also the space of academia to hijack it, to reflect upon our own difficult things in the movements and, try to produce some kind of solutions or propositions in order to make our movements better. So this time I'm going to talk about the work that I have been doing recently with another fellow activist and researcher, Vladimir Mentus from Serbia as well, where we are trying to kind of reflect on our own experience in the anti-eviction movement in the previous 3 years. So I would like to talk first about a few kind of terminological and conceptual approaches that we use or would like to suggest as a way to look at the struggles. So the first one is, as you can see in the title itself, it's connected to the infrastructure. And it's housing as a care infrastructure. So why are we using this kind of concept? So we are trying to find a solution of how to go in conceptual terms, like beyond what housing has become now, like recently, a financialized asset. So it's not anymore, like a place for living. This is not its primary function. So it's a place to park capital, to invest, and to gain profit from. And on the side of the state, it is looked as a male shelter, as four walls that should fit, like everyone. And this is just not happening. It was never like that before either. So we are looking at the household as the central locus of everyday care and social reproduction. And we are kind of trying to conceptualize housing as a hub of care practices and relations that keep humans alive. So we are also drawing on the research of some other feminist researchers that have characterized housing as an infrastructure of care in order to move analysis of housing away from policy research alone towards an understanding of the relationship between housing and the dynamic social and economic reproduction patterns that are the foundation of social organization. So in this sense, housing is conceived as a socio-material assemblage that is constitutive of care. As a care infrastructure, housing organizes social life, informs values, and reproduces social inequalities. And this dynamic system changes over time and orders care opportunities across three domains: the materialities of housing, markets, and governance. And the second notion that we want to introduce is the kind of like a hybrid notion that we kind of invented to address what we have been seeing in the struggles, and we call this notion infracommoning. So we start from the conceptualization, because we are, looking at the evictions as a kind of like space where we work and try to reflect upon. So we are looking at the different conceptualizations of evictions, and particularly the ones that see evictions as a distributed system on binding and unbinding people to a world in a movement. And that see evictions not only as a constant and continuous work of dispossession, but also as a site of resistance and commoning. So infrastructures always produce their negations, and these negations bear their own logic. So although, evictions produce suffering and loss, and this is what they primarily do, the eviction system can also become grounds to create and recreate anti-evictions commons. So this one was very important to us when we started thinking about the commons and the eviction struggles. So building on this argument that anti-eviction struggle produces commons, we use the term infracommoning to explain how commoning occurs in anti-eviction struggles. We use the verb commoning instead of the noun commons to imply a shift from a reified understanding of commons as entities to a processual understanding of commoning that encompasses resistance, relations, knowledge, and everyday experience And this is very much leading to the work that some Greek colleagues have been doing in conceptualizing notions such as mobile commons. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the scope of such practices of commoning has been broadened to include struggles to rewire broken care networks between institutions, households, and individuals. So we are interested in describing how new forms of commons emerged in a situation of generalized precarity through acts of caring that underline interdependence and reciprocity as a fundamental components of the social world. So we propose that the lens of commonings makes visible the care infrastructures that emerged in anti-eviction struggles. So now I would like to tell you a little bit about the dispossession of care in the context of Serbia. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm just going to focus on housing because I really have this like short time to tell you this story. So over the last 30 years, as many of you know, housing in Eastern Europe and in Serbia more specifically has become space for acceleration of social exclusion and care inequalities. The privatization of socially owned housing was enabled through the transfer of ownership from common ownership to the state ownership, and in this way it was privatized to the individual users of housing rights before this transformation. So today, Serbia is a home ownership country. The home ownership rate in Serbia is above 87%. Due to that massive privatization of socially owned flats, home ownership became the most important material condition for survival and a kind of asset-based welfare. So I think this is very important for us to understand, because in the Western countries, you know, ownership is all about this ideology of middle class, but in the East Europe, it's different. You know, like I was always struggling to talk with my colleagues because it's not the same. So at the same time, anyone unable to buy their homes, as well as new generations of young people, were turned into so-called losers of transition. The pandemic of evictions in Serbia was propelled by a series of legal changes leading back to 2011, which included the privatization of eviction procedures. These changes established public bailiffs, we call them public-private bailiffs, as a solution to what was perceived as a poor enforcement of court verdicts. So there was, I mean, it's still like that. There is this very slow court system, but the solution that they proposed is to introduce this like very fast institution that is executing all of these cases before, you know, they reach their final point. And this reform was adopted after the European Union pressured Serbia to improve the juridical efficiency of the courts as a precondition for accessing the European Union. So that there is this colonial or neo-colonial matrix, you know, behind this legislation, and how West is disciplining periphery and how is it turning, you know, how it's regulating also its housing markets. Because of this super home ownership countries exist, they didn't manage to insert this how to say massive private owners and renter system that exists in the West. So now the plan is, and this is always like suggested by International Monetary Fund, we need to get rid of this like home ownership quickly. So the bailiffs operate as a private companies with an interest in collecting the debt as a profit. Evictions arise from dispute over property, restitution, and the privatization of socialist companies, including cases of squatting, as well as debt and different frauds. Yeah, building on previous experience of organizing for housing and the city issues in 2017, bringing together a multiplicity of activist organizations and individuals, an anti-eviction movement has emerged in Serbia with a main focus on Belgrade, Novi Sad, and Subotica. This is 3 big cities in Serbia. This movement started using direct action. The aim has been to prevent eviction or at least halt them while legal and political negotiations are ongoing, while also putting pressure on decision-making process through protest campaigns. So during the informal moratorium on evictions in Serbia in March 2020, so there was not a formal moratorium as in other Western countries. That was just a recommendation that came from the state to the private public bailiffs that they should kind of take it easy, on people during pandemics. The No One Hungry, No One Thirsty, No One Without a Roof campaign was launched and included the organization of mutual aid for people in quarantine or the houseless people. The campaign raised, so this is the campaign that was started by anti-eviction movement during the pandemic. The campaign raised over 1 million dinars, nearly 10,000 euros in donations, and provided food, hygiene products, and medication to more than 1,000 people. This assistance was initially delivered to families who had previously been involved in anti-eviction struggles, but demand soon expanded to others who approached the campaign because they were struggling to survive under quarantine. The political demand was for the Serbian government to ensure basic needs for all, including housing, medical care, and utilities. So this common practice has created a temporary alternative care infrastructure that helped people in precarious conditions who had lost their source of income due to the lockdown and were struggling to keep a roof over their heads. And these practices are constitutive of what we have conceptualized as infracommoning, because they combine struggles for housing with struggles to maintain social reproduction and provide care. In this sense, anti-eviction solidarity and effort to produce oneself became forms of politicized care work. What's changed during the pandemic is the definition of housing itself, and I think this is very much important. So home is not only about defending the bare walls of housing anymore, so it is about sustaining the life within them. And I think this is the major change that we can see in the situation during the pandemic. Another thing that I wanted to remind you about is that these processes of infracommoning often happen in the gray zones of illegality within the care gaps left by the falling public institutions. Moreover, it can happen that acts of solidarity and care that are aimed at mitigating the crisis situation for people are criminalized. This is something that has intensified during the pandemics in Serbia. Even before the pandemic, anti-eviction activists faced threats of arrests or prosecutions for participating in solidarity actions. Unlike the auspicious forms of repression used by police, the private bailiffs companies use financial means to thwart anti-eviction infrastructures of care. Fines for resisting eviction that include also the associated costs of the attempt of eviction. So if you, for instance, resist the evictions, the costs are on you. So you just accumulate this horrible debt, like after resisting evictions, and they are used to deter and demoralize people that are defending their right to home. I don't know what is the time, how much time do I have? Because if I have time.
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. Okay, I will shortly tell you something, because I was also asked to kind of try to connect, housing struggles, care, art, because I recently published this edited volume on the radical housing, art struggles, and care, and I just wanted to bring up one example here, and this is another, change that we experienced during the pandemics, and this is the emergence of these intersectional struggles. Here I want to mention the case of eviction of the painter Dragana Milosavljević, who's also a professor in the university in pensions. She's 82 years old now. She was a victim of fraud. She bought a flat, like everything legally, like everyone else would do it. And it turned out to be that the person who sold her apartment falsified all the documents. And because, there is this slow court system and this fast institution of eviction, bailiffs came to her door to evict her. And she resisted eviction for almost a year, accumulated like a huge bills for this eviction. She was resisting together with the members of anti-eviction movement, the organization called The Roofs, but also a syndicate of visual artists, Ulus, joined in this action in resisting eviction of Dragana. And unfortunately, she was evicted in this summer, and also this union of artists showed the complete solidarity with her, like trying to accompany it with it because she became homeless. She was kicked out only with her cat. And all of her things were like taken to some depot, and she's supposed to pay for each day of her things being deposited there. And they also organized a couple of events in galleries when they also started to reflect and also connect these two issues, because the issue of housing is also the issues of artists, and this is something that is not as often kind of like asked in these spaces. I will just quickly go to a kind of conclusion and present you some reflections that we have been working on recently for a book chapter. And this is we want to avoid as much as we can this kind of romanticization of the notion of commoning and care and all of these things. So we really, starting like looking into kind of contradictions of these processes. And I won't tell you everything about, that we discovered. I will just focus on two things. So one of it is like, what kind of collectivity is this commoning, like producing? So what we, concluded is that the divides between the people in need and mostly middle class activists and the people from both middle and working class who donated the money, including the strict territorial borders that they kind of inhabit, were blurred during pandemics, but they persisted. So they were not erased. Those that donated money and other necessities such as clothes, hygiene products stayed outside the decision-making process. The poor and heavily, although they were invited, but they never joined. The poor and heavily racialized people remained in the role of aid recipients. So the temporary network reflecting material structures of organization of people in urban spaces, including sociocultural concepts of class and race, and at time increased class and racialized antagonisms. The we of the network bore severe internal contradictions that at times reproduce mainstream social composition while allowing these impossible and improbable encounters to happen. The other thing that we kind of looked at is what kind of solidarity economy is this actually. So to be able to explain this, I need to go a step back and just tell one sentence about our history. So people as infrastructure, and this is the notion that Abdulmalik Simon introduced to explain how people come together to produce this kind of bits and pieces of social fabric that is completely ruined. So in the case of ex-Yugoslavia, so to say, this condition was generalized in the wars in the 1990s, and they persist. So those who rewire the social infrastructure through institutions the least are often the racialized urban poor. The lockdowns and the main logic of pandemic management temporarily disabled some of the existing self-organized infrastructure networks, forcing the racialized urban poor to search for alternative solutions. So some of them, especially those facing evictions, those who had established connections with the anti-eviction movement, reached out for a temporary partnership that was offered by the social movement. In this unequal network, people were able to get the resources necessary for survival while continuing to fight for their homes. Soon after, activists terminated the action. Many people continued to demand the reopening of this redistribution network. Nevertheless, the activists were determined to end this redistributive action, not only due to their limited capacity, but also to separate themselves from so-called humanitarian work and go back to their primary political work of resisting evictions. As a result, people on the receiving end of this action returned to using their own resources for maintaining their day-to-day lives. In conclusion, so what can we learn from these crisis-driven connections and actions? If the pandemic taught us anything, it is that we already live our lives in common and that we are bound by shared responsibility to each other's lives. In this situation, infracommoning networks provide to be a kind of practical and political warfare in conditions of extreme precarity that have challenged apparatuses of state and police in order to reproduce lives. In the conditions of many fragmented realities, a temporary corridor was built against closed and racialized logic of emergency urbanism. Nevertheless, the space of mutual exposure and temporary collaboration was heavily conditioned by the underpinning racialized political economy of the place, in this case, Serbia. So how can we imagine and create a world beyond traditional forms of sociability that have been heavily challenged today by practices of everyday life in motion? How to build a model that will open up for multiple parallel processes to arise and forms of commoning to thrive? How can we connect unconnectable, invisibilized, marginalized, and divided struggles? Furthermore, what kind of politics can sustain living in common in given conditions such as Serbia? What this short episode in Serbia anti-eviction movement teaches us is that the society has to remain open to generative experiments of being together, learn from each other, learn from mistakes, assessing collectively, and doing accountability. It also taught us that we should not romanticize commons, commoning, mutual aid, and solidarity, but rather ask, what are relations of power in commoning processes, who is included and who is not, and what is the color of commons? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Are there any immediate urgent questions? Yeah, Lina, can you hear?
Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for your lecture. Yeah, so I would like, in the context of all of your discussions, having in mind what you all three of you said here, would like to bring another example from Serbia, and it is like this kind of new purposefully opening of the EU border for new set of guest workers in the area of medicine, mostly nurses, which was kind of basically signed with Germany, with the regime before the pandemic. I think this is something that completely unifies all of your three researchers in some way. Did this single case of really kind of opening the borders for the purpose, okay, we need the guest workers again, and like, yeah, so it was basically just a small comment, not so much a question. So just bringing up this single example, or one of many, I would say, examples that sums up several like points of your discussions.
I mean, I can shortly comment to this because this was included in part of our analysis that was dealing with the crisis and dispossessed commons. And this is not a new process. This is what I want to say. The drain of medical workers started like much earlier, and it's at this point the Serbia is missing around, I don't know, 20,000 medical personnel. It's something outrageous completely. You know, the healthcare system is completely crumbling. And what is happening now in Serbia is that you know, like these new private hospitals are thriving all around because you cannot get healthcare anymore in the public system. And what is happening is, again, that you know, like the people who are at the bottom, you know, like of the social ladder, that they will suffer the most because they cannot pay the expensive healthcare, you know, in the private hospitals. So yeah, thank you for that comment.
Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Otherwise, I also wanted to ask, but it's maybe on a slightly different train of thought, which was like this, where it's going back to Encarnación's provocation to kind of think about, or maybe, yeah, maybe it's also for all of you, like or could you just try to say more about this kind of relationship? Is there, there's also a question, is there a way to turn the camera towards the audience?
Not with this wall.
No, okay, no, there's a wall in the way, I'm so sorry. Okay, so yeah, to kind of to think about the relationship between commoning, so, or like social reproduction, or I'm thinking about like primitive accumulation is this kind of Marxist concept that also feminists have used a lot, and that is mobilized in social reproduction debates and these debates about invisible labor, and coloniality is this kind of ongoing colonial, as like an ongoing, or like the afterlife of colonialism in its ongoing manifestations. I'm just kind of wondering if there are thoughts about how to synthesize these ideas, and then, or how this kind of manifests in these struggles that we're describing, or in these, I think this does come up in the examples that you show these like also neo-colonial kind of examples of space, of area, and also in Anna, in your talk as well. But I just wonder if anyone has any more thoughts or something else to say about these connections.
Maybe I'll immediately, since you were looking at me. What came to mind, so I was working with different groups in different places outside of Europe as well, and mainly working with movements, and at one point got connected with the Lokvidya Antolan. It's the People's Knowledge Mass Movement of India, and I managed to get to know a lot of people and travel around quite a bit and see a lot of the consequences of what's unfolding there. So essentially extreme forms of what I was talking about taking place here, sort of like the Australian examples, but way farther. So you have a space which on the one hand is the quote unquote fastest growing democracy in the world, and very much targeting knowledge-based economy, space program, really pushing ahead in a big way, but simultaneously you have people living in what they're referring to as feudal conditions, which I would argue is pretty accurate. And what's interesting is seeing the direct relationship. So there's a lot of displaced persons, people who were working on the land who are no longer able to, so they've been displaced sometimes 2, 3, 4 times by corporate entities that come and take over. And they simply don't cater to the needs of the economy anymore. So they don't know where to go. They can't live on their farmland anymore. They're being pushed to the peripheries of the cities. That's where they're constantly being encouraged to go. And they don't have the skill set necessary to work there. And they're being convinced to try to get jobs that actually do cater to these types of knowledge economy positions. This is what they're being told: get jobs in tech, etc. And you can't tell an illiterate person to learn how to program better. So it's very interesting and kind of terrifying to see really how the argumentation is being used. But so one example, I was meeting with this tribal family that was living in the jungle, and they wanted access to electricity and water, which is something that I think many of us would like to have. And unfortunately, this is quite a common occurrence. They were told that they could only get access to these basic amenities if they could prove how educated they were. So they had to have some sort of basic schooling or literacy or something to be able to get access to water. So they had a cousin who had some sort of school certificate. They tried to take that to the local municipality in order to be able to get this. And then they had some sort of like electric tower installed, and they were so excited about this, and were talking to the local families to try to find some way of sharing this. Another point that I just remembered that's quite interesting, some way to share this, and it was never hooked up. It's just there as this kind of like empty symbolic thing. So even that argumentation didn't work. But this is in a town called Singrauli, which is supposed to be the energy capital of India, ironically. And not only are most people displaced and without electricity, but the people who have it for 1 hour a day. So that's what I remembered with the sharing thing. So everybody goes very quickly to plug in all of their devices to charge for 1 hour. So I mean, it's just absurd things that people are being convinced, if only you get more educated, if you do this, if you do that, if you move to the cities, things will change. But this is the reality that's taking place. So that's a very colonial example one that links to both old colonialism and contemporary forms, and really kind of shows this whole breadth of what's taking place.
I also think that if there is no one in the audience, I can't see the audience.
No, go ahead.
No, that I think that in a way, I always think that we need to think of entangled inequalities in a way, because they're new forms of capital accumulation or exploitation at the same time. But they are also enduring systems of domination, which I don't think they dissolve so easily. Even feminization, it's not something that dissolves because we have a new area in which labor is organized differently. And I would say that the colonial is a present, it's not just a past. I mean, we have settler colonial societies too, that shows us very clearly, if you have, I'm here in Canada at the moment, where you have reservations, where the question of water is set, the question of land is set, while you have big urban cities with a lot of wealth. So in this kind of context, this is actually something that creates the present that we tend to forget in Europe very often. And Europe is part of this history and present. So I do think that in a way we need to think about domination, and we need to look at Herrschaft. And I'm very interested, or I have been looking also at violence and structural violence as a way of thinking also how domination works. In its old form and new forms, because I think there was a moment during for Europeans, I would say, during the pandemic, and maybe for other regions too in the world, where we thought there might be something new coming up, new reorganizing, that will actually acknowledge that we are interdependent, that we can't continue living like that, and so on. And instead, within Europe, we got a war. I'm talking about the war in Europe. Of course, there are wars in other parts of the world. And we do have a restructuring of areas that it's actually within their retrogrades. I mean, we're going back to really rude and reckless forms of exploitation that we already know. And in regard to refugees, for example, what came to my mind before is that one thing that they did in Germany is to introduce the €1 jobs for refugees, which happened like, yeah, well, that's what we do, they need us and we need them. Let's have €1 and jobs. So I think that this kind of realities, besides of course having lagers and having zones where people are being held and having free trade zones where there's no unions and so on. I think that there was a time where we used to do more analysis about that, and I think we need to go back to this analysis too, while we are doing also an analysis of what is being kind of new restructuring. So yeah, it's just, maybe it's happening and I think it's not happening. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to what was said. I don't know, in the new work that I'm doing, I'm trying to look at the genealogies of evictions in Serbia after, let's say, from 90s to nowadays. And so my approach is really, and I think this is something that we really need to kind of like have in our mind when we do this kind of analysis, to really look at this kind of like capital, race, and colonial nexus that work together. Because I, like in my work also, there was always this kind of like blind spot, like in my research. So I was like, there's this whole of how to say, colonial nationalist rhetoric and also politics and like real horrible consequences for people's life in this very famous sentence, Kosovo is Serbia. You know, so in my work, you know, like I wanted to acknowledge that Kosovo is not Serbia, so I was actually never analyzing, you know, what was happening there. But I think that was also a mistake. So I need to go back now and, you know, like see how, you know, like this colonialism that Serbia was practicing was unleashed, you know, during this process of falling apart of Yugoslavia, and what has happened there and how it influenced really the life of people and other evictions that emerged, for instance, of Roma people that became a collateral in this war and they lost everything. I mean, this is just one thing. I mean, when we speak about the colonialism of financialization and also like the European Union colonization, we can analyze it through this kind of like legislation, but also like banking system that was introduced and how this start like moving eviction, how it also like works in this kind of like racial colonial and capital kind of lock, including, you know, like when I was talking about like what is a blind spot of anti-eviction movement in Serbia. It's migration, you know, like it's like the people that are being evicted, you know, like regularly from the tents they occupy, from, you know, like their temporary housing, you know, that they create for themselves on the borders while they're trying to cross. So there is no interpolation between the let's say migrant solidarity movement and anti-eviction movement, and this is something that we also need to acknowledge and analyze and you know, like figure out, you know, like how to bring these things together.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question at the back from the audience.
Hello, thank you very much for these very intriguing and interesting and thought-provoking presentations. That I think that there are many questions and things would be many things to ask, but one thing that is especially interesting me, I'm working as a curator and researcher, and I'm very much interested also in the public space. And I guess that in the first talk, there was a claim maybe towards thinking to the importance of mourning as something transpersonal, intrapersonal, and even public in a way. And then I was really interested in, Lina, how you differentiated between the invisibility, the two notions of invisibility you said, the discursive and the more concrete. And then also in Anna, I think in your presentation, there was also something about the example you gave about the practice of commoning in Serbia during the pandemic. So making basic needs or commoning as a way of publicly or making public goods or infrastructure available to people in need. So I guess there is an interest in the public, but not as not only as a physical space, but as a space of the political, so space that encompasses and brings together the physical, the discursive, the infrastructural, and the financial, so to say, economic level. So my question would be if the contributors could talk a little bit about how practice, or if they think that in their examples there is a practice, or there are practices of shifting the invisibility of social reproduction in care towards a visibility that is connected to the public and public space, or the public as a political. And I was also thinking, of course, of the activism of Black Lives Matter and so forth, where also people like Judith Butler talk about the importance of a practice of mourning publicly, of public mourning. So I hope this was not too labyrinthic, my question. Thank you very much.
I can go first. Yeah, I look at mourning as a public activity and as a communal one. And also, of course, the practices of mourning varied culturally and also regionally. There are regions where mourning is always a public, like in the south of Spain, in Andalusia. And so it's quite interesting at what point mourning becomes such a private and also punctual matter. So you do have a practice, you have a ritual, and that's it. And no one talks about it. I mean, I noticed that very much in Germany, which I was a bit struck and brought me actually to raise this question. Why is mourning such a private issue and why is it silenced? But then what we see and what I've been seeing, though, for example, the relatives and family members and friends of they have lost their loved ones to racist murders, very often say that they don't have time to mourn. Yeah, they say we actually don't have time to mourn because first there is the denial, there is the policing, the police violence, there is the whole economic situation that is devastating. So there are a lot of different moments that they need to deal with it very practically also, and also the pain and so on. What I realize looking at the different expressions is that they are all doing political work of mourning. And it's more and more also that this has become a common understanding that what's happening there, that mourning can be political. And of course, Butler has been speaking about it. But what happened also, and that's, I think, also connects, and I'm also interested in the infrastructure of the commons. So I look at convivial infrastructure. And what you can see is that there is an infrastructure, convivial infrastructure happening in this process of political communal mourning as labor, because I look at it also as labor, as work that is being done and work that persists.
Lina, do you want to say something?
I'm just going to ask you the same thing. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I can just maybe like mention an example. Like I'm trying to find something that is related to the work that I'm doing, and this is related to housing and home struggles. So in this book that I mentioned, this edited volume on radical housing, I Struggling in Care, there is actually one chapter, and it's about Sylvie Kretschmar performance that was made in 2013, and it thematized an eviction of ESSO houses in St. Pauli in Hamburg, and they created it's called the Megaphone Choir, the performance. And they created this performance when they were mourning about the evictions and the loss of the houses, and they performed it in public space as a way of sharing and kind of like channeling this sadness and this trauma that was created with people that were facing evictions and finally evicted.
A few examples came to mind. So a few years ago, there was in Vienna, the refugee protest march and camp. So that was quite a good way of taking something that was being made invisible in the outskirts outside of Vienna, There's a refugee camp there that people were living under abysmal conditions, and they then marched into the city and set up a camp in the very center of the city, close to the ring. And were there for quite some time, got a lot of visibility, a lot of media coverage. So that was quite an important step. I was talking about this town in India, Singrauli, this energy capital of India. After the activists went there and were meeting with people, so a lot of people felt very abandoned there because they had no connection to anything. I mean, being displaced so many times, having no access to electricity, you feel very cut off from the world. So they felt really that nobody knew the story. And partly why I often tell the story is because they asked me to as much as possible outside of India. But what we did while there was build a community center so that all of the different families could come together and have regular weekly meetings to share their experiences and basically create a kind of basis for future struggle. So that way now that was 11 years ago, they've been really demanding for certain rights and access and making their situation much more visible. So that's quite an important move. What I got to know in Calcutta or Kolkata is there's this very, very interesting, really well-established and quite massive sex workers union. So a group of activists and medical workers got together and helped. Also, they brought legal professionals together and they helped the local sex workers to create their own union. And it's really this massive, impressive thing. And they taught them how to govern the whole thing themselves and set everything up and gave them the legal knowledge and everything else connected to that, and then handed over all of the capacity to them. And it's great. Before that, a lot of people didn't have access to medical care. They didn't have access to different forms of protection or knowledge that they necessarily needed. And there were, of course, a lot of people from the rural areas who were displaced, who were brought into the city and put in these kinds of positions and didn't really have the knowledge they needed. And through the work of this union, a lot of things were made visible, and it's really quite present also in international discourses. Another one I thought of, and this will be my last one, is in Gujarat, I think. So on the west side of India, there's this big, it's basically like a township built of women. It's called Seva, the Self-Employed Women's Association, I think. And it's this whole phenomenal self-governing place. So they have their own banks and shops and schools and everything that they set up themselves, from self-education and just training themselves to set up this whole place. So they escaped a lot of situations of violence and displacement and other similar kind of conditions, and came together to build this very strong space and also to make their otherwise very invisible struggles quite visible through the creation of this huge collective work that they do.
Thank you. So I'm just noticing that it's 9:05, and I think that we were meant to finish at 9. But I also just wanted to add that like Mourning also takes place in stages, and your comments also made me think about the London riots after Mark Duggan was killed, and this seemed like also kind of this kind of moment of anger was for sure like a moment in a kind of process of collective mourning. Just as another example, but we could think of so many, I think, and the kind of politics of the different iterations. But are there any other, or like maybe we should wrap up, but just in case, like I don't want to stop anyone if they have a really urgent, yes, Yelena, okay. If there's a kind of really urgent thought.
There is just one small, actually very big question of why is not migrant movement happening? Which conditions have to be set and by whom so that this actually happens and that migrants gain political power, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, migrant movement is happening. I mean, it's like huge movement of people. We didn't see something like this in history, happening. This like massive, like change of place that is taking place with everything that is happening on the way. So I think that movement is really alive and happening. So and I think it's gaining political importance with its presence, and it's changing everything. We saw it like from 2015, but even before, I think, it's kind of like rewiring everything. How we think, like how we think politics. I think it's a major change. This movement is a major game changer. This is happening during our lifetime. That has happened during that. Now, I also remembered another example for the kind of political mourning that I recently encountered while I was attending the No Border Feminist Summer School in Palermo. So I met there like a group of people who call themselves captains, or they are kind of like framed as captains. So this is people who are crossing the Mediterranean on boats, and there is this awful thing that the legal system is kind of prosecuting people that hold the I don't have an English word now in my word, but something that when you drive a boat, you need to hold it. There is a word for it. Anyway, so this so if the they and they do this kind of like photographs from above, and if they identify you, you can end up going not to a camp but to 100% security jail and face like a horrible sentence in prison. So these people were organizing. They created their own association, and they also in Palermo last year, and I think it's going to happen again this year. I think it was in October. They came together with some other local people and activists to kind of publicly mourn the loss in the Mediterranean, and there was a kind of like a get-together program, kind of community thing, and also this kind of like a ritualistic release of balloons with small boats made of paper in the air.
I also think that migrant movement is happening in very different forms. I mean, migration was always there in a way. It has transformed the whole perception of what we understand as the nation state. I would say migration and coloniality, because there is also a complication in migration. Which migration do we talk about? Do we talk about the 19th century or 18th century migration, mass migration to colonial territories from Europe and the kind of settler colonial states that were established? But what I think it's important also in regard to when this is voiced, also the rights that migrants voice, and they're voiced in different ways. I have been part of a project in Germany that's about migrant feminism, where we did oral history interviews with activists in the 80s and 90s. And so doing this kind of work, it's also a political intervention, because it's a history that is forgotten. The accounts that I've been listening to of the relatives and families, it's also the immediacy of the political that is being talked about. So it's not only the big political organizing or creation of certain activities, but the activities in which you are in and how they are significant for it, and how they transform, and how they create this collectivity also in it. It's something that is being very much voiced. So I would think the political from a different angle, from a more kind of situated, I would say, immediate life angle, and also interconnected also to the environment people live in. Environment also in bigger terms.
I can just more or less repeat myself and just say that making these forgotten histories that were just mentioned, or all of these different things that are being made invisible, making them more visible, and this shift in perception of understanding that we don't need to buy into all of this talk of crisis and catastrophism and all of this nonsense, and to understand how much agency we actually have and how much we have in common. But as Anna said, I mean, a lot of things are already happening, and many of us sitting in this room are proving that. And I think we just need a few shifts, and the present and the future are very shaky and turbulent, and who knows how things will unfold. But I think there is quite a lot of things that we can do to intervene in what's coming up.
Thank you. I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. So I would like you to join me all in thanking Anna, Encarnación, and Lina. Really rich conversation. I hope we all feel not just depressed, but also motivated. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Apparently there are drinks in the next room. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know how we're going to manage this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You can see the audience a little bit.
Oh.
Can they?
Thank you.
No, I don't think so. You have to turn on the
it's this
camera.
one. It's this camera. Ah.
He said you have to turn on the.
Oh no.
Ah.